for 2020, huh? Hi everyone, my name is Leanne. Today I'm going to be looking back on my reading in 2020. I'm going to be bringing you some graphs, there's going to be statistics, and I'm going to be looking forward to my reading year in 2021 and figuring out what I want to prioritize with my reading life. There are lots of things that changed about my reading life in 2020. I did do a full video talking about how my reading has changed as a result of the pandemic, which I will leave links down below and in the cards if you want to hear more about that kind of thing. So, my main goal with my reading in 2020 was to reduce my physical TBR to fewer than 100 books. And I said, look, if it was 99 books at the end of the year, I would be happy. Did I do that? No. Towards the end of the year, a number of unforeseen books came into my life. I received some very generous gifts, which I'm very grateful for. Some things changed about my reading this year, which we will get to, which I do think contributed to why I haven't achieved this goal, but ultimately it's my fault. But we are inching closer. So at the start of 2019, my TBR stood at this number, and then at the start of 2020 it stood at this number, and now it's 125 books, which is pretty close. Like, it's 1 or 2 reading months away from being below 100 books. Already in January, however, I have 2 videos coming to you very soon. I have an unhaul video, which of course is going to reduce my physical TBR number, but then I also have a haul, which is going to overall take it up. But it will still be like 2 or 3 reading months. So, the new goal, my friends, is a physical TBR of fewer than 100 books by the end of the first quarter. I've really tried to look at the root of the problem with my physical TBR, because I read 177 books in 2020. Like, that's more books than I've ever read in a year. Of the many books that came into my life in 2020, I only have 37 that are still unread, which I'm really pleased about. Like, that's fewer books than I would even want on my TBR. Like, I think maybe like 60 books is where I would want my physical TBR to be. So I really am reading and acquiring, I think, at the same pace. The problem is really the books that I acquired in 2017 and 2018. There are a lot of those books that I still have unread. There are a few stragglers from 2015 and 2016, and with the exception of Moby Dick, I want all of those books off my TBR by the end of the year. A lot of the books that are still on my TBR from 2017 are classics. There are a few contemporary books still on there, so I would also like all of those off my TBR by the end of the year. And I would like to have made progress with the classics. So another one of my goals for 2021 is to read 10 of my Penguin English Library books. Reading all of my Penguin English Library books is very much like a long-term goal. Like, it's something that I'm not in a rush with, but they do take up a fair percentage of my physical TBR, and I would just like to be mindful to try and read some of these books. In order to keep me in check with my reading goals, I'm going to talk about quite a few more goals I have later on in the video, but in order to keep me on track, I am now going to be doing quarterly statistics videos and quarterly reviews of my reading. Essentially like this video, but a bit shorter. Just checking in with myself to make sure that I am ticking along with everything that I want to do, or re-evaluating that goal and adapting it. So let's get into the statistics for my 2020 reading. I'm going to be touching on my goals as I go through this, because a lot of these goals are based on what I've learned from looking at these statistics for 2020. So as I said, I read 177 books in 2020. My reading stats are based on 175 books because there are 2 books that are mysteriously missing, and can I be fucked to find out what they are? Absolutely not. I know one of them is from May and one of them is from August, but that is all I can tell you. It's just 2 books. I don't think it's going to skew the stats that much. I've also rounded up the percentages here just for ease, so don't come for me if they don't add up to 100%. So 16% of the books I read were under 100 pages. I read a fair bit of poetry. I read a few picture books this year, so I'm completely fine with that. 15% of my reading were between 100 pages and 199 pages. 29% of my reading were 200 to 299 pages, and also 29% of my reading was between 300 and 399 pages. That's really my sweet spot for novels, for example. Like, that's the length I like a novel to be. 11% of my reading were 400 to 499 pages, and only 1 book I read this year, so 0.5% of my reading were books over 500 pages. According to Storygraph, the total page numbers I read was around 40,000 pages, but I think this statistic isn't quite right because not all of the correct editions are on Storygraph and that kind of thing. We'll get to Storygraph in a bit. I don't have any particular reflections or goals in terms of page number. I'm very happy with this. It's not something that I think about all that often. So let's just move on to publication date. And when I'm talking about publication date, I'm talking about the original date that these books were published, not the particular edition that I read. So 3 books I read in 2020 were 2021 releases that are yet to come out. So that's about 1.5% of my reading. There's then 31% of my reading were 2020 releases, 22% were 2019 releases, 8% were 2018, 25% were published between 2000 and 2017, 7% were books that were published between 1945 and 1999, 1.5% were published between 1900 and 1944, and again 1.5% were published in the 19th century, and I read nothing that was published earlier than that. Again, nothing really in particular to say about the publication dates, but looking forward to 2021, there may be some older books included in this at the end of the year because I'm making that effort to try and pick up my Penguin English Library classics. In terms of the format, I was reading my books in about 3/4 of the books that I read in 2020 were books that I read physically, and about 1/4 were books that I read digitally. In 2020, I rejoined NetGalley, so that has definitely upped the percentage of digital books that I read. In terms of where I got these books from, 50% of my reading were physical books that I had either bought for myself or someone else bought for me. Then 25% of my reading were books that I got from work. 14% of my reading was e-arcs, so these are the books that I've got from NetGalley. We'll talk about NetGalley in a second. 9% of my reading were books that were sent to me by a publisher other than the one that I work for. 7% of my reading was audiobooks. 5% of my reading were books that I got in book swaps. This was something I wanted to record in 2020 because I was acquiring a lot of my books that way, but that really hasn't happened this year because of, you know, the world. So I'm probably not gonna record that in 2021. Only 1% of my reading were ebooks that I had bought for myself, and 0.5% of my reading were books that I borrowed. This was The Black Flamingo, which I borrowed from the library. I borrowed it just before the world shut down. I had intentions of getting lots more books from my library, but that didn't end up happening, of course. So, NetGalley. My NetGalley percentage currently stands at 33%, which I'm not really that happy with. The ideal percentage rating that you should have for books you've reviewed on NetGalley is 80%, and I really think at minimum you should be at 50%. So my ambitious goal is 80% and my being kind to myself goal is 50%. So simultaneously, I want to be prioritizing reading my NetGalley books but also reducing my physical TBR. A lot of my goals are kind of contradictory and kind of work against one another, and that is kind of why I want to do these quarterly check-ins to just see how I'm getting on, see if there's anything I need to reevaluate, anything that seems to be taking precedence over something else. So that is my next major goal, to improve my NetGalley rating. In terms of the diversity of the books that I'm reading, 81% of my reading is by women, 17% from men, 1.5% were anthologies that had contributions from lots of different genders, and 1% of my reading were by non-binary authors. I have always read the majority women. I don't want that to change. I'm completely happy with that. I would like to read a few more books by non-binary authors, but beyond that, quite happy with this. Roughly around 1/3 of my reading were by authors of colour, 2/3 by white people, and I did read 3 books that had contributions from people of lots of different backgrounds. 30% is an increase from previous reading years, but this is something that I would definitely like to continue with. I would at least like to get this up to 40%, like at least. But unfortunately, only 16% of my physical TBR are by authors of colour. When you factor in NetGalley, that only increases to 23%. So I need to be continuously making a conscious effort to, when I am buying books by authors of colour. I need to be getting rid of any unconscious bias I might have that is turning me away from those books in favour of something else. I also want to be listening to a lot of audiobooks by authors of colour. And again, this is what I mean by my goals kind of contradicting each other. You know, if I want to prioritise reading my physical TBR, I shouldn't be bringing more books onto my physical TBR. I shouldn't be listening to audiobooks that I don't own, but I want to prioritize all of these things. And again, that's where the quarterly check-ins come in. So the types of book I was reading. My reading was made up of 56% novels, 21% non-fiction, 10% poetry, 6% short stories, 5% picture books, and I read just 1 play, so 0.5%. Quite happy with that, honestly. There's not really anything I would want to change there. And when did I read these books? For the first few months of the year, my reading was really consistent. So in January, I read 16 books. In February, I read 14 books, 16 again in March and in April, 15 in May. My reading took a very slight dip over the next couple months. I read 10 books in June and July respectively, and then it started to get a bit more consistent again, so I read 14 in August, 12 in September, 14 in October, and 14 in November. And then in December, where I had a lot of time off, I read 27 books. I will leave my most recent wrap-up linked down below in the description and in the cards so you can check it out if you would like. A lot of those books were very short in an effort to reduce my physical TBR because I realised I needed to get closer to that goal. All of that is absolutely fine with me. I don't really have any particular thoughts on it. I also have some interesting stats that I have taken from Storygraph. Storygraph is a new platform which is an alternative to Goodreads, and it is just so much better than Goodreads in my opinion. I think about 3/4 of the way through the year I decided to join Storygraph, and I thought I would continue to update Goodreads and have them simultaneously, but I just completely abandoned Goodreads. Don't think I will ever use it again to track my reading. Storygraph isn't perfect. As I said, there is issues with the particular edition of a book that you are recording, but overall the positives just completely outweigh the negatives, and I mean, it's not owned by Amazon. So yeah, let's look at some of these charts. I think this mood chart is really interesting. So I read 88 books that were apparently reflective, I read 61 books that were emotional, and I read 50 books that were challenging, and they're what make up the bulk of my reading. 43 of the books I read were light-hearted, 31 were informative, and 28 were funny, and then the slices of pie get a bit smaller. This is all based on information that is put in by Storygraph users, so I find that really interesting. As you can see from this chart on pace, about a quarter of my reading is classified as slow paced, and then a quarter is fast paced, and then about half is medium, which I just find quite funny. I think this genre chart is really interesting. According to this, the bulk of my reading is contemporary, which I would agree with, but I find it really interesting that it's then young adult and poetry. I think the reason why this probably is because I don't think young adult and poetry will be split out into genres in the same way that adult fiction would. So adult fiction might be split into mystery, it might be split into classics, into fantasy, into romance, whatever, whereas I think poetry and young adult won't be split out that way. What I do find quite interesting is this LGBTQIA+ bar. According to this, I've only read 11 books in 2020 that come under this umbrella term of LGBTQIA+, which as a member of the queer community myself, I would like this to be larger. It's also provided this graph on my star ratings. Now, a lot of my reading data is imported from Goodreads, where I wasn't able to give book 0.25 stars, 0.5 stars. I only started giving the 0.5 variations of stars and 0.25 variations when I joined Storygraph and was able to do that. So I think in 2021, this graph will be a lot more indicative of my reading year. There are a few more charts that Storygraph provided, but I've already covered that information in my own statistics. So looking into 2021, I've already covered some of my goals. So getting my physical TBR to below 100 books by the end of the first quarter, reading at least 40% people of colour, reading 10 of my Penguin English Library books, and getting my NetGalley percentage up to at least 50%. I would also like to reread some books this year. I'm not a massive rereader anyway, but the reason for this for quite a long time was the fact I only had my unread books with me, whereas this year I came home to my mom's house, I have had my full book collection with me, and it is the perfect opportunity to do some rereading. Again, this kind of contradicts me trying to get my unread books down, but I think we can do all of these things and reassess as we go. This is a really random one, but I would really like to focus on reading the hardbacks and the trade paperbacks on my shelves. This seems like a really random one, but I am someone who has moved around a lot over the years. I don't really know when I will be moving back to London. I don't really know when that's going to happen, but in sort of preparation for when that does happen, I would like to have mainly B format paperbacks that I'm transporting. I will just be taking my unread physical TBR with me, and hardbacks and trade paperbacks, they're just bulky, they take up a lot of space, so if I can read those before I eventually move back, whenever that may be, that would be really helpful. So they are the kind of reading goals I have. There are a few channel and video goals that I have. As I said, I will be doing the quarterly stats videos, but there are a few other series that I would like to do. I will be doing the series on getting into publishing, which I have promised for a very long time. If you want to hear about my new role in publishing, I will leave that video linked down below and in the cards. I started doing vlogs for the first time in 2020, and I would like to continue that into the new year. I would like to do at least 6 vlogs over the course of 2021. I'd like to host the Irish Readathon alongside Aoife and Elaine in March. This will of course happen, but I always like to make it a goal. This is a readathon where we encourage people to read more Irish literature than they normally would. If you pick up one book by an Irish author in March, that's it, you have participated. I would also like to do a colour series on my channel where I take like 5 red books, 5 yellow books off my shelves and talk to you about them. Books that I maybe don't normally get the chance to speak about, and this is just about me making use of these shelves and having my full collection with me. I don't think I've made the most of that so far, and if there are any videos that you would like to see from me, please do let me know down in the comments or send me a message on Twitter and Instagram. All of my social media is linked down below in the description, so if you do have anything you want to see from me, please do let me know. Some random little things, as I said, no more Goodreads. Don't want to use Goodreads at all. What I do want to use, however, is bookmarks. Now this seems really random. I did a video a while ago where I admitted my chaotic energy in that sometimes I just leave books open like this, and I've had a few disasters recently. I have so many bookmarks. I'm just reading in my house. They should all have a bookmark. Really random, but that is one of my resolutions, to use bookmarks. Something else I want to do in 2021 is I would like to pre-order 5 books. I don't really know what they're going to be yet. I'm trying not to look too far into the future because I don't know when I will be leaving this house and going to London. Like, I have no idea, but I would like to pre-order 5 books. I do have some kind of personal and professional goals, but I'm not going to talk about those here. I almost made a video at the start of 2020, which was like my goals for the year, and I just for whatever reason didn't get around to doing it, and I found a list of these goals recently, and I'm so glad I didn't, because I haven't been able to achieve any of those goals because of the world. So I think I would like to keep my personal goals kind of just to myself. They're just written down to myself. Something that I didn't talk about is like how many books I want to read in 2021. For the past several years, I have set my reading challenge at 100 books, and it's been very achievable. This year I upped it to 150 when I realized that was also going to be very achievable, but this isn't something that I have to actively try to do. I just read over 100 books in a year. Anyways, I feel like this video has gone on for ages. Congratulations if you've made it to the end of this. Thank you so much. Leave me a little emoji so that I know that you're here, or if you have anything to say about anything I've mentioned in this video, do leave me a comment down below. Wishing you all of the joy and success for your reading in 2021. I hope you guys are doing well, staying safe and taking care of yourself, and I will speak to you in my next video.